The war had ended almost a year ago, yet the silence that followed still felt louder than the air raids ever had. Cleveland was supposed to be alive again, its factories humming, its streets filled with laughter, but every sound seemed hollow, like an echo of a world people weren't sure they could return to. Mary Ellen Parker knew that silence well. She heard it every morning when she walked into the maternity ward of St. Luke's Hospital. There were cribs now that stayed empty for weeks, lined neatly in rows, waiting for babies that never came. The women who did arrive were tired, fragile things, their eyes full of fear instead of joy. Some came alone, their husbands still somewhere across the ocean or lost forever. Others whispered about the price of milk, the ration stamps that had barely disappeared, the cost of hope in a country trying to start again. Mary Ellen was 30. With hands that still trembled when she folded the corner of a baby blanket, she'd been a nurse during the war, tending to wounded soldiers at a field hospital near Bastogne. There were nights she'd held men younger than her brother, whispering lies about home and safety while their breathing slowed and stopped. When she returned to Ohio, she thought working with newborns would heal her. She thought new life would silence the ghosts. But even here, the war lingered. She'd watch young fathers standing in the hallway, men with medals still pinned to their coats, trying to smile at the sound of their firstborn's cry. Yet behind their smiles were the same shadows she'd seen overseas, that haunted look of someone who'd learned too much about how fragile life could be. Many didn't stay long. They went off to find work, leaving wives behind with infants and ration books and a brand new loneliness that no victory parade could fix. One afternoon, in the quiet lull between deliveries, Mary Ellen found herself staring at one of the unused cribs. Sunlight from the high windows painted it in pale gold, making the white sheets gleam. It looked too clean, too untouched, like something built for a promise that never came true. She placed her hand on the railing and thought of the little wooden cradle her husband, Thomas, had made before he shipped out. It still sat in their bedroom, covered by a quilt that hadn't been moved in years. He'd come home alive, but not whole. The man who used to hum while he shaved, who'd carved their initials into the barn door the day they married, now sat for hours on the porch staring at nothing. Sometimes he'd talk about the noise of the engines, about men who didn't wake up. Other times he'd just go quiet mid-sentence, as if a piece of him had stayed behind somewhere in France. Their house had space for laughter, but it only held memories. The neighbors had 3 children already. The couple across the street hung diapers on the line every week. And every morning, when Mary Ellen passed the empty cradle, she felt the weight of what wasn't there. At the hospital, posters had begun to appear on the walls, government prints with slogans in bold blue letters: "Build families. Build America." They showed smiling mothers in tidy kitchens, holding babies wrapped in flags. The nurses joked about them, saying Washington must think you could fix a nation just by filling nurseries. But Mary Ellen couldn't laugh. She knew the truth. Those posters didn't show that people were still afraid. Afraid to start again, afraid to believe in something that could be lost. That evening, she stayed after her shift to help clean the nursery. One of the janitors had brought in a radio, playing soft jazz that echoed down the tiled hallway. As Mary Ellen wiped the counters, a tiny cry broke the silence. Room 3. She went in, and there, wrapped in a yellow blanket, was a newborn boy, small, red-faced, alive. His mother, exhausted but smiling faintly, whispered, "He's ours. He made it." Mary Ellen leaned closer, her throat tightening. She touched the child's hand, and for the first time in months, something inside her softened. The baby's fingers curled around hers with surprising strength. And in that moment, the world didn't seem broken. It was fragile, yes, but alive. When she stepped outside that night, the air was cool and still. Somewhere down the street, a baby cried in a house where the lights glowed warm. For the first time in a long while, Mary Ellen didn't turn away from the sound. She stood there on the steps of the hospital, hands in her pockets, and whispered to no one, "Maybe it's time to hope again." The war had emptied so many cradles, but perhaps, she thought, one by one, they could be filled again. Spring came late that year, as if even the seasons were hesitant to move forward. In Cleveland, the snow melted reluctantly. leaving behind gray slush and the smell of smoke from 100 chimneys still burning coal, yet. In the windows of the little post-war houses, something began to change. Curtains appeared where plywood had once hung, flower pots returned too. Porches. The city, cautious and scarred, was learning to breathe again. For Mary Ellen, the hospital became a world of its own. A small island of warmth and movement in a country trying to remember what normal felt like. There were more births now, though still not enough to fill the ward. Couples arrived clutching ration books and baby blankets sewn from old uniforms. Some had saved pieces of silk parachutes to make christening gowns. Others brought only faith and a few dollars. Whispering apologies to the nurses for their threadbare clothes, one morning in early April, Mary Ellen found a folded newspaper in the break room. On the front page, in neat, proud print, it read, "America welcomes the baby boom." It was the first time she'd seen those words together. The article spoke of new housing projects, returning veterans buying homes, and birth rates finally climbing again. But what caught her attention wasn't the numbers, it was the photograph beside them. A young couple, arms around each other, smiling down at their newborn in a wicker cradle. She stared at that picture longer than she meant to. Not out of envy, but recognition. It reminded her of the promise she and Thomas had made when the world was still simple, before rations, before telegrams, before the long silence that separated who they were from who they had become. When she came home that evening, she found him in the shed, sanding a piece of wood. The smell of sawdust filled the air. He didn't look up when she entered, just kept his hands moving, careful and slow. "What's that?" she asked gently. "Fixing the cradle," he murmured. One of the legs cracked. "It's old wood." She stood in the doorway, the faintest smile crossing her lips. It had been months since he'd touched it. Maybe a year. They didn't speak much after that. The radio played softly, a big band tune that once would have drawn them into each other's arms. Now it was just background noise, a ghost of better days. But as the sun dipped low, she saw something different in him, a calm she hadn't noticed before. He still carried the war in his eyes, but maybe, just maybe, he was beginning to let go. At the hospital, the rhythm of life began to shift. Every week, new mothers filled the ward, and laughter, uncertain at first, returned. Mary Ellen would help them swaddle their babies, adjust pillows, teach them how to breathe through fear and love at the same time. She became the quiet witness to hundreds of small miracles. The way a newborn clenched a father's finger, the sound of a mother's first sigh of relief. One day, she received a letter. The return address read War Department, Medical Corps. Her hands trembled as she opened it. Inside was a certificate of commendation, recognition for her service in Bastogne, for extraordinary compassion under fire. At the bottom, in neat ink, was a note from an officer she barely remembered. "We never thanked you properly." The menu saved still talk about the nurse who sang hymns in the snow. She folded the letter carefully and placed it in her pocket. It felt strange, being thanked for something she'd spent years trying to forget. That night, as she walked home through streets alive with laughter, she noticed the grocery store windows displaying baby formula, cribs, and strollers, things that had been impossible to find just months before. She stopped in front of one window where a little sign read, "Back in stock, for new beginnings." The next morning, she brought the letter to the hospital and tucked it inside one of the empty cribs. She didn't tell anyone. It felt right, as if part of her past belonged among the symbols of what the future could be. By summer, Cleveland's nights were filled with the hum of lawnmowers, the clinking of glass bottles, the cries of children playing in the street. Mary Ellen found herself pausing outside her own house more often, listening to the faint music of it all, the ordinary chaos of people living again. One evening, Thomas asked if she wanted to drive to the lake. It had been years since they'd gone. They sat on the hood of the car watching the sunset burn gold across the water. After a long silence, he spoke, a voice low, unsteady. "I think we can try again," he said. "If you still want to." She didn't answer right away. The wind carried the faint laughter of nearby families, and she looked at his hands, rough, scarred, but steady. Then she nodded. Yes, she whispered. I think it's time. In the distance, the city lights flickered to life, one by one, like tiny promises being fulfilled. The world was learning to hope again, and so were they. By autumn of 1946, the city seemed to have finally shaken off its grief. Cleveland's factories thundered again, bus stops were crowded with men in gray work coats. And new housing developments sprouted like fields of hope across the outskirts. Newspapers now called it the new American beginning. For the first time in years, the front pages spoke more about families than battles, more about new homes than fallen soldiers. Mary Ellen saw the change most clearly in the maternity ward. Where there had once been silence, now there was a hum, a soft, beautiful noise made of lullabies, nervous laughter, and the rhythmic cries of newborns discovering their voices. Every bed was filled. Some days the waiting benches in the hall overflowed with anxious fathers. Clutching cigars and pacing floors polished to mirrors, the nurses joked that the world had rediscovered love. Mary Ellen smiled but didn't say much. She was too busy trying to keep up. It was on one of those long shifts, somewhere between midnight and morning, that she met the family who would stay in her heart forever. The mother's name was June Harper, a small, quiet woman from the factory district whose husband, Charlie, had been a machinist before he'd gone overseas. When Mary Ellen entered the room, June's hands gripped the bedrails, knuckles white. Her face was pale, eyes unfocused. "Breathe with me," Mary Ellen said softly, "in through your nose. That's it." Hours passed. The storm outside beat against the windows, but June never let go of her hand. When the baby finally came, the cry that filled the room seemed to echo through the entire building, not sharp or startled, but strong, certain, alive. June looked at her son through tears. Whispering, "We'll call him Charlie, too." Something about that moment stayed with Mary Ellen, the way June held the child close, trembling not from fear but from disbelief that life could begin again after so much loss. Later that night, as she tidied the room, Mary Ellen found a small scrap of paper on the nightstand. Written in pencil, it said, "For every empty chair, a new heartbeat." She folded the note and slipped it into her pocket. Back home, Thomas had started talking more. He spent his days repairing tools for neighbors, sometimes refusing payment, saying, "It feels good to fix something again." On weekends, they visited the new subdivision rising outside town, rows of half-finished homes built for veterans through the G-bill. The lot smelled of fresh pine and wet cement, and each one looked the same, yet full of promise. "Imagine," he said one afternoon, standing on a dirt road between foundations, "a place like this, with kids running everywhere. Can you hear it?" She nodded. Though what she heard was a memory, laughter from long ago, before the world turned gray. Weeks later, Mary Ellen began to notice something new inside herself, not joy exactly, but a quiet expectancy, like the earth waiting for spring. She found herself humming again at work, brushing her fingers across the smooth edges of the cribs she'd once avoided touching. One day, while folding linens, she overheard two nurses talking. "They say next year's going to break all the records," one said. "More babies born than any year in history." "After what we've all been through," the other replied, "maybe that's what we need most." That night, Mary Ellen sat on the porch with Thomas. The crickets sang, and the air smelled faintly of rain. She took a breath, then said the words she hadn't dared to before. "Maybe it's our turn," she whispered. He looked at her, really looked, for the first time in a long while. And for a moment, his eyes were the same soft brown they'd been when he proposed under the elm tree behind her parents' house. He reached for her hand, rough and warm, and she didn't pull away. In the weeks that followed, life seemed to move differently. Every sunrise felt like a promise instead of a repetition. Every newborn at the hospital carried not just the hope of one family but of an entire generation trying to start again. Mary Ellen began keeping a small notebook, writing the first name of every baby she helped deliver, a list that grew longer each day: Grace, Samuel, Helen, Robert, June's Charlie. When she read through the names, she realized something simple yet extraordinary. The world was rebuilding itself, one heartbeat at a time. In late November, when the first snow fell, she and Thomas went into the attic to find the old cradle. Dust covered it like a memory, but underneath, the wood still gleamed. She ran her fingers along the rail where he had once carved the initials M+T. "Needs a little sanding," he said, lifting it gently. "No," she smiled. "It's perfect just like this." Downstairs, as they placed it beside the window, she could almost see sunlight spilling over it the way it did in the hospital nursery. For the first time in years, that empty cradle no longer symbolized loss, it was a space waiting to be filled. Outside, the sound of children playing in the snow drifted through the air, small voices, full of laughter. She listened, and this time, she didn't feel envy, she felt belonging. The world was changing, and quietly, within the walls of their small house, so were they. By the spring of 1947, the hospital halls were overflowing with sound. The cries, laughter, and soft murmurs of new beginnings echoed day and night, a living rhythm of America's recovery. Nurses moved swiftly from room to room, doctors smiled more. And the janitors began to whistle again while mopping the polished floors. The nursery that once felt like a chapel of silence was now a chorus of life. Mary Ellen stood by the window of room 5, where a newborn slept under a patch of warm light. She had seen hundreds of babies by now, but the sight never lost its quiet power. Each one, she thought, was a tiny act of defiance, a promise whispered to a world that had almost destroyed itself. "We will begin again." Outside, new homes were rising along freshly paved streets. The G-Bill had turned empty fields into neighborhoods, and with every hammer strike, a new chapter began. She sometimes passed by on her way home, watching couples paint fences, plant tulips, and hang laundry on lines that fluttered like flags of peace. The air smelled of sawdust, soap, and optimism, a scent she would forever associate with healing. At home, the Parker house was beginning to change, too. The old radio had been repaired. Thomas had cleared his workbench and started building toys out of leftover wood, small cars, blocks, and one rocking horse with a mane made of twine. He didn't talk much about the war anymore. The nightmares had grown less frequent. Instead, he filled their evenings with plans, talk of expanding the garden, painting the porch, maybe even taking a trip to see the ocean someday. And then, one quiet morning in June, Mary Ellen felt the unmistakable flutter of life beneath her hand. It wasn't fear that took her breath away, it was wonder. She sat down slowly, pressing her palm to her stomach, and whispered to no one in particular, "We did it." When she told Thomas that evening, he froze for a moment, eyes wide, as though afraid to believe her. Then he laughed, the kind of laugh she hadn't heard in years. Unguarded and full. He lifted her off her feet and spun her once, both of them dizzy with something they hadn't felt in a long time, unshaken hope. The months that followed passed in a haze of small miracles. Neighbors brought casseroles and advice, and even the postman left a note that said, "Congratulations, we need more of those." At the hospital, her colleagues teased her gently, saying it was about time she joined the mothers she'd helped for so long. She took the jokes with grace. On a late November morning, after a night of steady rain, their daughter arrived. The delivery was quick but intense. The kind that seemed to pull time apart and sew it back together again. When Mary Ellen finally heard that first cry, sharp, pure, alive, tears streamed down her cheeks. Thomas stood beside her, hands trembling, looking down at the tiny bundle wrapped in the same yellow blanket Mary Ellen had used in the nursery. The sunlight broke through the gray clouds just then, filling the room with soft gold. "She's perfect," he whispered, "just perfect." Mary Ellen reached for his hand, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. The world outside seemed to disappear. All that existed was the warmth between them, the rhythm of that fragile new heartbeat, and the cradle waiting at home. A week later, they carried her into the house, the same house that had known years of silence. Thomas set the old wooden cradle beside the window, the one he had built before the war. The wood was still smooth under his hand, though time had left its gentle marks. He lowered their daughter inside, her small fingers curling around the edge of the blanket. Mary Ellen stood beside him, resting her head on his shoulder. The light fell across the cradle, illuminating the initials carved long ago. "M+T, she's what we were waiting for," she said softly. He nodded. All this time, outside, children's laughter carried on the breeze, blending with the faint sound of a radio playing in a neighbor's yard. Somewhere in the distance, a train whistle echoed, not a sound of departure anymore, but of connection, of lives moving forward. The war had taken so much years, friends, innocence. But standing there in the golden light of an ordinary afternoon, Mary Ellen realized something profound. Survival was not the same as living. Living meant daring to hope again, even when the world had once taught you not to. As the baby stirred, she reached down and traced her daughter's tiny hand. "Welcome home," she whispered. That night, as the house grew quiet, Mary Ellen sat by the window watching the soft rise and fall of her daughter's breathing. The cradle that had once symbolized emptiness now sang with life. And outside, across the city, thousands of other cradles did too, each one a testament that humanity, no matter how broken, always finds a way to begin again. When stories like this fade, a part of who we were fades with them. If you believe some memories deserve to live forever, stay with us, subscribe, and keep the past alive.